Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us for the fourth session in the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada's webinar series, PRC Power Abroad and the Guardrails We Need. My name is Veena Najibola, and I'm the Vice President of Research and Strategy here at the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada. This series examines the evolving tools the People's Republic of China uses to advance its interests internationally and the practical guardrails Canada and other countries need to engage China strategically while protecting our values, our sovereignty, and economic and national security interests. Today's session is titled China's Toolkit in the Rules-Based International Order. China's relationship with the rules-based international order is, of course, complex and conflicted, neither one of simple acceptance nor outright rejection. Beijing participates actively in the international institutions and frequently invokes established principles such as sovereignty, development, equality, and human rights. And at the same time, it contests how these principles are defined and applied, selectively resisting rules that constrain the party states and seeks to reshape international norms in ways that better reflect its own political system, interests, and conceptions of global order. In our discussion today, we will explore Professor Potter Pittman's concept of globalized populism. And of course, I'll introduce our guest in a minute in more detail, but his concept of globalized populism is a way of understanding this behavior. In particular, we will examine how China draws on perceptions of inequality, historical grievance, institutional complexity, and Western dominance to justify what Pittman describes as anti-elitism, grievance, and practical resistance. We will consider how this framework helps explain China's differing responses to various transnational challenges, and of course, also a look at what this all means for Canada, as well as other democracies and other countries as we recalibrate our relationship with China. Of course, the timing of this webinar and this whole series is important because in the case of Canada, we are recalibrating our relationship, and Prime Minister Carney is practicing what he calls principled pragmatism when it comes to our foreign policy. And so I think Professor Pittman's framing, as well as his contribution to this discussion, will be well-timed. Professor Pittman Potter is Professor Emeritus of Law at the University of British Columbia, and he's also a Distinguished Fellow here with us at the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada. He's a member of the Order of Canada and a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. Professor Potter is one of Canada's foremost scholars of Chinese law, governance, and international policy. His extensive research and writing have examined China and in areas including international trade and investment, business regulations, dispute resolution, human rights, and the relationship between domestic legal system and international norms. Before his retirement from UBC, he also practiced law in British Columbia and Washington State and California, working on China-related business and arbitration matters. So his scholarship therefore combines deep legal expertise, extensive knowledge of China, and a practical understanding of the challenges facing governments, but also businesses and institutions engaging with PRC. He's written a number of books, his most recent books exporting virtue, China's international and human rights activism in the age of Xi Jinping. But he also just published a book fresh off the press called China and the Rules-Based International Order, Globalized Populism and Crisis Response. And that this book, which is fantastic, and I recommend it to everyone, will form the basis of his presentation today and also our discussion. So without further ado, Professor Potter, it is a pleasure to have you on this webinar. Thank you so much for making time. Really look forward to this discussion. So I'll turn to you now for your presentation. You have a PowerPoint for us. And right after that, I'll offer some questions, but we also have an opportunity for all of you who are joining us live to ask questions. So please submit them. You have instructions in the Q&A function there now, and we'll come to them towards the end of the hour. So with that, Pittman, the floor is yours. Thank you again.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And I'm delighted to be here. And I want to thank the foundation and particularly Veena Najibola and also Elizabeth Donkavort for their efforts to bring this off. So thanks for that. And it's really going to focus on my new book, China and the Rules-Based International Order, Globalized Populism and Crisis Response. And there you see, and Veena's already shown it to you. So if we go to the next slide, it's important that we recognize the importance of populism We've seen much discussion of it, and both in North America and Latin America and so on. And its importance is critical, and it's also important for our understanding of China. So I think it's useful to provide a little bit of an overview of and the first is looking at the foundations of populism. Where does it come from? And I've identified, after looking at quite a lot of literature and examples of countries in North and Latin America and Europe and Asia, a major factor is inequality and resentment. And we've seen a lot of discussion about the role of inequality in international politics and in conflicts and so on. And the writings of Piketty and many others show that. And the resentment that comes from inequality is a foundation for much of the populist social movements that we've seen over the last decade or more. Another feature of it, which I've been working on myself over the last number of years, is complexity and alienation. And here it's a question of basically the lack of confidence, the loss of confidence in increasingly complex systems, which do not lend themselves to sort of intuitive understanding. So when we talk about the political system and all of the details of managing, whether it's voting or regulation or what have you, and much of that is beyond it doesn't leave ordinary people with a sense of confidence that it works for them. Similarly with economic regulation, similarly with social regulation. So both inequality and resentment and complexity and alienation are key factors in the emergence of populist sentiment. Now, when we look at the locations of populism, emerging in societies is key, and that really comes out of this resentment over inequality and alienation over complexity in governance, the economy, and society. But populist ideology and populist rhetoric is often adopted by regimes, and we've seen that again in North and South America. We've seen it in Europe. We've seen it in Asia, where regimes adopt populist rhetoric. And the key to remember is leaders who articulate that rhetoric don't necessarily believe in populism, but they're using populist rhetoric as a way of building political support. And so we see the difference between policy and rhetoric in regime populism. And one of the challenges, of course, is once populist movements, for example, take political power and become regimes, they start to run out of domestic adversaries. They start to run out of domestic targets for their populist ire. And so they turn internationally to look at the inequalities in the international system, to look at the complexity issues in an international system, and to start pursuing the activity that I describe as practical resistance, which is basically changing the conversation, changing the discussion, changing the narrative, so that in the populist sense, the interests and perspectives of ordinary people are given more attention, and the interests of elites are more criticized. It's important to recognize that populism generally is not either a right wing or a left wing matter. It's really spans that, and we see in right wing or regressive populism an ideology of essentially sunk cost, that values associated with society are tradition and have been part of tradition for a long time, and to move away from them is a cost that is not wanted to be bared by those regressive populists. And we look at Make America Great Again as a perfect example of that. On the more left wing or progressive side, we see an opportunity cost where there's an imagined future, as opposed to constructing an imagined past of the good old days that we have somehow lost in what we see in regressive populism. Progressive populism looks at an idealistic future that is unrealized, and the opportunity of achieving that is not achieved because the political and economic costs of the system just prevent that. And so progressive populists tend to argue for an imagined and a hopeful future and criticize present arrangements as not fulfilling those ideals. Okay, next slide, please. So there are key features of populism which are evident in all of the cases that I've looked at. Anti-elitism is a key foundational feature. A second is grievance ideology, and both of those are essentially reactions to current conditions. And then you see practical resistance as a more proactive effort to, again, change the conversation, change the narrative so that it gives more priority to ordinary people and less attention to privileged elites. And these three features, anti-elitism, grievance ideology, and practical resistance, are very important for building resilience for populist movements because it allows them to be essentially insulated from current political, economic, and social systems. Next slide, please. So practical resistance is the more proactive, and we see it as expressed in normative building and laws and regulations and so on. And I've identified three ways of sort of thinking about this. One is accountability in political relations. The second is prosperity in economic relations. And third is community and social relations. And we can look at what populist regimes, and in this case China, have done in those areas and compare it with international standards, which is really the focus of the book. Next slide, please. So when we look at policy practice and accountability, and that's the political side, and we've applied this to the COVID-19 crisis, there are issues of outcome accountability and a spectrum of alternatives between aspirational accounts of results and empirical accounts of results. When we look at process for government accountability, we see the tension between instrumentalist legal systems that are aimed at fulfilling policy goals and universalist legal systems that apply to everyone. And then with information accountability, we see the tension between use of information for propaganda and to shape opinions and use of information for transparency. So all of these are not dyads, they're really spectrums, but they say a lot about how China has managed the question of accountability in the COVID-19 context. Next slide, please. If we look at climate change, I've looked at that in terms of prosperity and the policy practice there. The key features are measurement. How is prosperity measured, and is there reliance on macro or micro data? How is prosperity distributed? Is it distributed through firms or directly to individuals? And to what extent is prosperity autonomous? Is it autonomous from the market disciplines, or is it autonomous from state control? So if we look at the accountability side, the prosperity side, and the next slide, please. The community side, we see these various elements. In the community, we have identity, diversity, and mobility, and the alternatives that are listed on your slide. And those provide a framework for assessing the norm building, the regulation issues, the law building, and so on of populist regimes such as China, and then being able to compare those with the international system. Next slide, please. So when we look at China's globalized populism, of course, populist rhetoric has long been part of China's political environment from the earliest days of Serve the People, and many of those placards are still up in government compounds, to the current or recent discourse on common prosperity. Both of those are just laden with populist notions of protecting the common person, protecting ordinary people, and challenging elites. So China has also in their political history challenged local and international elites. Class struggle is an example. The three worlds theory that challenges superpower dominance, and the ideology of self-determination are all part of this populist resistance to international elites. You see China actually repressing social populism at home. So labor movements, environmental movements have largely been suppressed. And we saw the attempt by Bo Xilai in Sichuan to kind of build a populist movement. And then we see how he fared, which was not well. So I think it's fair to say that the Chinese government under Xi Jinping in particular has had a lot of populist rhetoric in its toolbox, but when it comes to actual populist activities, has been quite skeptical about them. And we see instead a shift to globalized populism, which is to say populism aimed at international challenges. Next slide, please. So we see the factors of inequality and resentment and the conditions of international socioeconomic and institutional inequality. Part of the issue is China would suggest that it's not treated fairly or equally in the context of socioeconomic behavior and institutional relations. When we look at complexity and alienation, we see many statements by Chinese leaders, Xi Jinping among them, challenging the conditions of international socioeconomic conditions and institutional conditions as being complex to the point that China does not see how they help it. We see efforts of anti-elitism, grievance, and practical resistance. And we look at Xi Jinping's speech to the 100th anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party of China in 2021. We will never allow any foreign force to bully, oppress, or subjugate us. That's classic populist language. Xi Jinping at the CBC's 20th Congress in 2022, we have unswervingly opposed any unilateralism, protectionism, and bullying. And those are two examples of anti-elitism and grievance. And in practical resistance, the enactment of the core socialist values under Xi Jinping's rule basically appropriate quite a lot of Western liberal values like democracy, rule of law, human rights, but massage and adjust them to China's needs and resist the imposition of Western standards. Next slide, please. In the process of this, Xi Jinping, again at the CPC 100th anniversary, but also elsewhere, has applied rhetorical markers of populism to those features of anti-elitism, grievance, and practical resistance, such that anti-elitism is described as or portrayed in terms, justified in terms of sovereignty. Nobody should understand the resolve and the will of the Chinese people to defend their sovereignty. And development, the focus on China's development. And that is China's often made the point that the international system does not give sufficient credit or recognition for China's development needs. And then human rights is a way that China challenges the conditions of human rights as articulated in the liberal system, and instead goes toward a more collective rights over individual rights, hierarchies of rights, so that development is more important than political rights, and so on. And so those are three markers of PRC populism that express China's way of dealing with the populist questions of anti-elitism, resentment, and practical resistance. Next slide, please. So, having set out that briefly, that overview of populism and China's globalized populism, I look at three case studies: COVID-19, which is a very antagonistic process; climate change, which is a more participatory process; and involuntary migration. And today, in light of time, I'm only going to look at the climate change dimension. So if you could just go straight to that, it's great. And we see statements or evidence of China's resistance to inequality and complexity in the global climate system. Although the 1993 ratification of the Framework Convention on Climate Change contained the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capacities, and that is a nod to the inequality of states in both responsibility for and cost of managing climate change. Kyoto Protocol, China signed it in '98 and ratified in 2002, and that also reflects those inequality and complexity questions. And then the 2009 Copenhagen Summit, the apparent or alleged inability of that summit to address the concerns of developing countries like China was one of the reasons that it had limited results. Next slide, please. China's 2011 white paper on climate change underscored China's developing country status, underscored its vulnerability, underscored the potential for climate change to have negative effects on China's development. So these are other examples of China's reaction to inequality and complexity in the international system. Next slide, please. We see evidence of anti-elitism and grievance in the statements by, for example, the Ministry of Ecology and Environment, which says that addressing climate change is not done at others' request, but on our own initiative, and promoting international cooperation on the basis of principles of common but differentiated responsibilities. And this is an example of expressing practical resistance through new norms that challenge the existing ones. Next slide, please. A major focus of this was the Glasgow conference in 2026, COP 2026, which was in 2021. And we see China resisting the revision of the Paris temperature targets that called for temperature adjustments to well below 2 degrees centigrade and ideally to 1.5 degrees centigrade. And there was a proposed revision to just make it a firm 1.5 and took away most of the flexibility, and China opposed that. China resisted the methane pledge, which was to limit the emissions of methane. China was instrumental in changing the language on coal power from phasing it out to phasing down in order to protect its extensive reliance on coal and associated economic and political interests. And then on the finance side, the creation of the loss and damage facility or dialogue. China wanted a facility that was very well financed and very active and effective. And the consensus at the COP meeting was that there should be a dialogue on it. More has gone on, but China has still complained about that loss and damage process not being sufficient to meet the needs of developing countries like China. Next slide, please. China's resistance has been expressed through economic prosperity questions, and this has there's context in China's history of this, and you see that on the slide. I won't go through it in great detail, but China has had a long process of economic policy that has really varied between the question of accumulation and distribution. And in the recent years, we've seen them move toward common prosperity, which has quite a lot of populist resonance. Next slide, please. We also see the imposing of rhetorical markers, sovereignty to protect China's climate change policies, development to justify those policies, and human rights to articulate conflicting priorities between needs of individual people and the needs of development. Next slide, please. When we look at China's activity on climate, basically we looked at a whole range of major institutions, but there's quite two in particular, the Ministry of Ecology and Environment and the National Development and Research Council of the TIWA. And those two have quite a lot of competition between them on these issues of measurement in terms of reliance on macro and micro data, distribution to firms and individuals, and autonomy from the market and from the state. We also looked through dozens and dozens of major climate change documents issued over the last 10 plus 15 years to identify the attention toward macro and micro data, the distribution to firms and individuals, and the autonomy from market and from the state. Next slide, please. So when we took that together, it's a very interesting situation because when we look at the rules-based international order, relatively liberal standards, measurement is done, local disaggregated indicators are primary, distribution of prosperity is through civic individuals and groups, autonomy of prosperity is largely from state control but to a certain extent from market discipline. If we look at China's standards, the classic model would have been reliance on macro indicators, distribution through enterprises, and protection from the market through state control. But the common prosperity doctrine has mixed that up quite a bit. And so now there's more attention to micro data, more attention to social benefit, and more but continued attention to state controls. And so you see this disparity on this table. Go ahead, next slide, please. So I do a similar analysis with migration, and we won't go into that in detail, but it's more of a passive populism where China has not confronted the system as it did with COVID. China's participation is not nearly as fulsome as it was with climate, but it's rather kind of a passive resistance populism where accepting the standards of the international system, but just not implementing them. So you can skip to the recommendations. So in the recommendations, I suggest that this conceptual approach of globalized populism, with its effort to explain it through equality and complexity questions and the role of rhetorical markers, provides opportunities for policy response to try to cure those or address those issues. Next slide, please. In the rhetorical marker of sovereignty, questions about limiting sovereignty. The marker of development, accepting the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, but also tempering that in light of China's own examples of development. And finally, the issue of human rights is to acknowledge diversity in human rights standards, particularly civil, political, and economic, social, and cultural, but equally noting China's ratification or signing of multiple international treaties means that its human rights practice is really a matter of treaty compliance. Next slide, please. So then if we go through the crisis-specific responses, and I'll leave these on the sheet, we see a number of matters on climate change and measurement of prosperity, distribution, and autonomy. And these have actually a great deal of resonance for the behavior of firms. So in my last minute, what I'll just say is that the measurement of prosperity and the tension between microdata and macrodata has a big impact on the information that firms receive about local economic conditions, the information firms are required to produce in terms of feasibility studies and so on, and all of those turn on how these measurements are indicated, and the macro-micro question affects that directly. The distribution question is where distribution is to firms, that has a big impact on foreign businesses, whereas if the impact is to individuals, that has an impact on their employees and has other resonance within those firms. And when we talk about autonomy, clearly a key question for firms is to what extent is state control and market discipline going to be prominent? Next slide, please. So basically what I've tried to do in the book and in the context of this talk is to understand and respond to underlying causes of China's globalized populism, to develop policy and political responses to the questions of inequality, resentment, and complexity and alienation, to respond to China's rhetorical markers on populism, the anti-elitism and sovereignty question, the grievance and development question, and the practical resistance human rights question, and then to support rules-based international order standards on accountability, prosperity, and community. And I would just close by saying it requires us to be patient. This book is really about supporting change from within and providing information that change from within can use, and it means a long-term commitment. But hey, we're talking about China, so that's shouldn't be a surprise to anybody. Okay, that's it. Thank you so much, and I think I stayed within the time or close.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Pittman, for that great overview of your new book. And I know how difficult it is to tell an academic that they have to do a talk in 20 minutes. And I am very grateful that you stayed within time. And we will make the full PowerPoint available to everybody who signed up for the webinar and also as a follow-up online with the recording so people can see the fullness of your presentation. But I do want to dig into both the kind of the practical policy recommendations that came towards the end of your talk, but also let's spend a minute on the conceptual framework that you put forward with this idea of globalized populism and this idea of shifting from domestic populism to globalized populism that is really the central concept. And I want to understand how this framework helps us understand China's behavior in ways that maybe more conventional explanation based on national interest, ideology, or great power competitions do or do not. So maybe if you could expand a little bit on kind of how this fits into other frameworks for analyzing China's behavior.
Well, I would just start by saying that globalized populism and the analysis in this book is intended to complement existing rational actor models and national interest models. It is not a substitute for those. It's supposed to be part of the mix in that analysis. When we talk about rational actor is grounded in perception. Rational actor is grounded in the process for determining outcomes. But if we don't acknowledge the importance of China's populist sentiments, the grievance in particular, the anti-elitism and so on, we start to miss many of the motivations. And so if our proposals are grounded in a rational assessment of numerical measures of development and how if we just cut taxes and increase business autonomy, that everything will go swimmingly, that lacks the cultural context, which is just essential for dealing with really any country, but particularly with dealing with China. So the populist sentiment is a critical part of China's perception of the world, and it creates trust problems because in the West, we may say, well, we are opening up information on exploration of natural resources or rare earth trade or what have you. And if we if we present those in rational, objective terms, how could anybody object, you know? But the problem with the populist perspective is there's a fundamental question of trust, which means that we have a higher burden to try to make our case to our colleagues in China.
That's really interesting. So in the book and in the talk, you presented sort of China's grievances about inequality, Western dominance, and institutional sort of complexity. And I guess my question would be, how should we distinguish between grievance as a genuine cause of China's behavior, of PRC or CCP's behavior, and grievance as a political narrative used to legitimize the pursuit of power or sort of the broader strategy of the CCP? In other words, like China's language of humiliation and bullying, can that be both sincerely held and strategically instrumental?
Well, of course, the the rhetoric of populism is part of China's political discourse. And
Mm,
whether the people articulating that discourse actually believe it or not starts to become less and less relevant because the
mm,
more that the populist discourse is embedded in the rhetoric of foreign policy or international relations or what have you, it creates its own kind of critical dependency channel, which makes variation more difficult. So the issue about
mm,
populism rhetoric is not so much whether the articulators of that actually believe it, but rather how does it constrain their freedom of movement on things. So, for example, on Taiwan, which is,
mm,
I know, an issue that
mm,
people are concerned about, much of China's behavior on Taiwan, and particularly the rejection of protectionist views from, say, the United States or Canada or Europe and so on, is grounded in this anti-elitism. Who are you to tell us what to do? This notion of grievance. You don't give us credit for our
mm,
uniqueness and the importance of our possibilities, and practical resilience in the course of white papers and regulations that legitimize China's use of force against Taiwan. So their
mm,
justification of these against the international system is grounded in these populist principles of sovereignty and so on. And that allows them, or almost compels them, to be more or to be less receptive to international calls for restraint on Taiwan than they otherwise might be.
mm. Interesting. And I guess then I also am trying to understand how sort of this framing around globalized populism interacts with other features of the Chinese system, right? So other analysts have emphasized, for instance, the kind of the Leninist character of the party state, or the Xi Jinping's ideological worldview, or China's longer term strategic ambitions. So how would sort of this framing around populism interact with those other characters of the system? And even if whether they believe all of those other things, but there are some element of rhetoric commitment to those things as well, right?
Well, the rhetorical commitment from Xi Jinping in particular was evident in the 100th anniversary and in many other
Yeah.
speeches where he articulates the question of opposition to global elites and China will make its own path. The articulation of grievance against international elites that do not give China credit for its own development achievements, but also interest in China's development needs. So those are
Mm.
embedded in these various discourses. They're not the entire discourse, but they're an important illuminating component of them.
So you feel like they all coexist essentially, and that this and your contribution with this book is adding to some of those other frameworks and other systems that people analyze in China.
Right. I mean, I think when we look at the Leninist Party state, for example,
Yeah.
uh, and I talk about this in the context of governance and the issue of processes for governance and rule of law, rule by law, and those sorts of things. So if we look at that purely from a rational actor institutional
Yeah.
development standpoint, we could easily come to conclusions that the Leninist state no longer serves its purpose in a globalized, market-oriented world. But if those who are holding on to that ideal are doing this because of populist sentiments on anti-elitism
Mm,
and resistance to the international system, then the actual merits of the debate have less importance. And it's more a question of how do we
mm.
hold on to a discourse that protects us against these elites. And I would say the
Makes
same thing
sense.
in terms of Xi Jinping's ideology, which is that he's articulated these norms so many times in speeches to the UN, in his own, again, the 100th anniversary, but many
Yeah.
others, that they do become, as you suggested, a rhetorical constraint on freedom of motion. And we can
Yeah.
see this in the way that he responded to criticisms of common prosperity. Common prosperity
Yeah.
really embodied much of the Xi Jinping populist perspective, but got a lot of criticism from within China and outside China. So then it was moved to the new economic development paradigm and the new economic development system. But that showed the kind of the difficulty in moving away from a populist position, which actually in some ways was very popular among the disadvantaged in China, which was an audience that Xi Jinping was speaking to. So that rhetorical constraint is, I think, exemplified in that particular. episode.
That's great. I wanted to look, I know you covered in your presentation kind of out of the three examples that you looked at the issues that you look around COVID-19, as well as climate debate and then involuntary migration. I wanted to get your thoughts on why you chose those three topics and sort of what each of them show us about the application of this framework. And sort of, and then maybe then broadly, how that actually can help us with some of the other areas that you didn't cover, more difficult areas around security. So you mentioned Taiwan already, but others as well.
So thank you for that. And one of the things I did, and that I was thinking about during the early stages of thinking about this book, is the crises of the world. And it seemed to me that the
Mm,
three most obvious crises were COVID, which was going on at the time that I started this book, climate, which has been going on for as long as we can be talking about it, and refugee migration. We just need to read the headlines to see how many people are drowning in the Mediterranean Sea, for example. So
yeah.
these are major crises, and I just had to pick them. But it also allowed me to get into the classic differentiation between political authority, which is key to public health management, prosperity and economic policy, which is a key question in climate change policy, and the issue of building community and society, which is a key question on migration. So it seemed that
Mm.
those three were not only critical crises in themselves, but they allowed me to get into the political, economic, and social dimensions of populism for China's rhetorical position.
And if you were to pick a fourth one, looking, for instance, at the emerging technologies or sort of the kind of the fourth industrial revolution, where would you put that on the spectrum here?
Well, and as we first to admit, and I mentioned in
Yeah,
the book, that these three categories of political, economic, social, they all overlap. But you can
yeah,
pick a particular case like COVID as a particular example of questions about governance and accountability. So if we're looking at for AI, for example,
yeah.
AI, although it's often portrayed as simply an efficiency mechanism for the economy, in fact, it's a critical question of governance because the question of governance over the economy is essentially what differentiates countries like Canada from countries like China. And so the question of I would put into mainly the political governance category with the expectation that it has an impact on prosperity, it has an
Mm,
impact on social relations. And so each of the
makes
current
sense.
crises you would, because the analysis there attempting to explain China's behavior. So we're going to say, well, AI could be, it's economically oriented, obviously, it has social impacts with lost jobs and so on and so forth, but it's first and foremost a question of governance. And that's essentially uh, dare I say, academic poetic license to categorize these things, but recognize that they do overlap. But I
Yeah.
think that crisis, I mean, another one is the law of the sea questions and the harvesting of minerals off the seabed. And that is, again, a combination of prosperity questions and governance questions. And so that invites a debate about which of those categories it would be in. And I think Taiwan I mentioned already. But so I think what we
Yeah.
want to do is the crisis itself serves as a vehicle for understanding a more fundamental question, which is the governance accountability dimensions of populism, the prosperity dimensions of populism, and the social community dimensions of populism, rather than being a comprehensive grand theory on that particular crisis.
Mm. So when we kind of fully look at some of the policy implications of what emerges from your analysis and looking at these case studies and China's behavior, I guess one way to look at it would be that you recommend patient engagement or sort of building Chinese confidence that the international order does not threaten China and can offer meaningful participation, sort of. And I guess an easy critique, and I'd like you to address it, would be to say that that approach has been tried for the last several decades, right? The engagement
Yeah,
approach in
yeah.
terms of trying to integrate China and institutions. And under Xi Jinping, we've seen more centralized approach at home and a more assertive approach abroad for China and for the CCP. So I guess the question would be, why would further reassurance and further engagement and encouragement to participate produce a different result?
So in the recommendation section, and I tried to touch on this today, but I really think the focus is on change from within. I think we
Mm,
have to recognize that Xi Jinping is not going to be with us forever. I think Canada, one of Canada's major strategic challenges right now is preparing for a post-Xi Jinping China. I think we spend a lot of
Mm,
time and energy worrying about how we're going to respond to Xi Jinping's latest post, but in fact, he won't be with us forever, and we need to prepare for what comes after. And I know from my own experience of interacting with a number of people in China that there are levels, very high levels within the government that are very amenable to the notion of greater accountability of government, greater distribution of prosperity, greater integration of the social system. And so I think the question is to provide analysis which helps them make their arguments. We're not making them for them. It's
mm,
a matter of internal change. It does take patience. But I also would say that in my recommendations, I've also mentioned a number of things. One is that the recognition of different approaches to human rights does not give China a blank slate to work with, or because the issue is really one of treaty compliance, and China has signed and ratified many human rights treaties. So the issue is not about imposing values on China. It's a question of saying to China, you've signed and ratified these treaties, you have to uphold them. The same
mm,
thing on climate change, recognizing China's development needs, but at the same time, not giving China a veto over climate measures internationally, but trying to adjust China's interaction with them in a way that does protect its legitimate development needs and development concerns. And on the public health question, I mean, COVID was COVID, but it's not the last public health crisis we're going to see.
yeah.
And part of that is really about how do we help any country, but China, for the purpose of this book, develop the perspective on accountability, either in outcome accountability. Do we depict our outcomes in terms of aspirational praise or in terms of empirical reality? Do we have a process for governance that is relying on instrumentalist law to fulfill policy goals or universalist rule of law systems? And
Mm,
the issue of information. Is it going to be used for simply propaganda to move public opinion, or is it about real transparency about government? And having that discussion put in the arms, if you will, of an intellectual class, a political class, a commercial class in China that can act on them in right now it's hard because of the Xi Jinping repression regime. But as I say, Xi Jinping is not going to be there forever. And our real challenge is to prepare for a post Xi Jinping China. And I hope that these efforts try to contribute to that.
thank you. I mean, there are a couple of things I want to follow up on, but I also want to remind our audience that they're free to submit questions and to please do so in the chat. I'll get to them in the next 10, 15 minutes. But the couple of questions that I wanted to follow up on, Pittman, was in this idea of change from within, which I think is obviously makes a lot of sense, and the change would have to come from within China. And to the extent that you're sort of encouraging dialogue and institutional engagement and sort of speaking the language that might be most attractive to interlocutors on China's side, where is room for, in this analysis, is there room for leverage or for changing some of the incentives when PRC is not actually acting in an accountable way or following its treaty obligations? So in other words, kind of in the toolkit that's available to us, in addition to dialogue and institutional engagement, where do you see the role for to the extent that it's still possible in the current international environment for accountability and for holding China to actually to account?
Well, thank you for that. And this is something I've thought about quite a lot. And I think the first thing I would say about that is that legitimacy of the regime, both domestically and internationally, is probably one of the most important goals of that regime. And so that's
Mm,
why foreign powers dealing with China, when China's doing things that we don't like, we need to say that that's the case. And we need to deny the legitimacy of that behavior. China, and you know from your experience, and I think most of the
yeah.
people in this audience know, when they're engaging with foreign agents, say foreign actors, foreign firms, they really want foreign firms to be in a position of taking the picture at Zhongnanhai and suggesting by implication, if not expressed words, that China's doing good and China's great and all this
Mm,
legitimacy building stuff. And we should deny that ground to them when they behave on human rights things like Tibet or Xinjiang or South China Sea or other things that are not constructive. So we have movement, and I think the legitimacy
mm,
challenge is important important part of that. But I also, I just have had a deep skepticism over many, many
Mm,
years over the impact of sanctions. And in my early
mm,
years in China, I wrote about intellectual property protection, and the US imposed several rounds of sanctions against China for an intellectual property regime which was seen as substandard and denying access to the US market unless China changed things. So the change in text happened, but the change in behavior didn't really happen. And so
mm,
I think that there is a real limit to the ability of sanctions and those kinds of formal traditional mechanisms for inducing behavior. And actually, there's a new book out which I just read a review of, called America and the New Choke Points. And it uses
mm,
America's control over international financial systems as an analogy to the old British perspective on seagoing choke points, and that access to the financial system is a key point of leverage for the U.S. over states that it wants to induce particular behavior from. But the basic point of the book is it hasn't worked and it's never really worked. And it really hurts the people of particular countries rather than the regimes themselves. So
mm.
I think, it's not that we should turn our backs on sanctions regimes. And I have a classmate of mine was very, very involved in that in the U.S. for very many, many years. So I understand the work that goes into it and the logic. It plays into a logic, but it's a logic of Western liberal capitalism. It's not necessarily a logic of developing societies that consider themselves to be oppressed minorities, to be disregarded, to have grievance, to be anti-elitist and that populist element. So I'm not saying we shouldn't do those kinds of concrete, hard edge efforts, but we should be modest in our expectation of
Mm.
their effectiveness. And I think the trying to influence things from within is certainly a worthy complement to that approach.
I understand. And I think the call for modesty and humility when engaging with China is well taken. I want to use the remainder of our time maybe to look at specific implications for Canada, both for our policymakers in Ottawa and provincial capitals as they deepen engagement and visits and approaches with China, as well as what it means for private sector stakeholders. So maybe starting with government, are there specific recommendations or tools that folks in Ottawa can draw from your book that you would point them to?
Well, I think the discussion of um, accountability in governance is a key area
Yeah.
where Canada can emulate best practices. And part of it is we have to set an example ourselves. We're not in a position to be dictating or preaching to other countries about improving their political systems when we have our own challenges. So we do need to set an example ourselves. But I think there are areas there in governance, particularly rule of law questions, and information access and transparency and so on, where Canada can model best practices, and that modeling
Mm,
can have an impact on the discussion. In fact, I know it already has had an impact on those discussions in China. One of the things that I say, I'm afraid that I confined it to a footnote, but I might have made more of it, which was to say, we've been engaged doing the engage with China thing for quite a long time, but you know, China is not going to change in 20 years. It's not going to change in 30 years. I mean, our efforts have had an impact, and we look at the judicial training program that the Canadian government supported had a very significant impact on a number of judges, many of whom have risen to very senior positions in the regime. At the moment, they're kind of keeping their head down, but they benefited from that training program immensely. The exchanges of law professors and law students has had immense but micro impacts. But we just have to keep it up. I mean, again, I hate to say it, but it's like sort of like Rome wasn't built in a day. I mean, we have to continue. And actually, the continuation demonstrates our commitment to the longer term cooperative relationship with China rather than seeing as just an instrument of achieving a particular immediate purpose, such as change their IP system or opening their natural resource market to foreign investment or so on. So I think that the book is laden with examples of efforts that have already been made in China to try to deal with the question of prosperity, the question of community, the question of governance, and we can continue to highlight those, but there are some specifics in there too.
Hmm. I mean, I think it's interesting because a lot of your recommendations sort of rely on this idea of patience and a long time horizon, right? So, as you
Yeah,
hinted at this post Xi Jinping sort of China and the opportunities that might arise, but of course, that might be several years out. And in the
yeah,
meantime, there are realities today that policymakers are having to grapple with, kind of balancing the opportunities and the need to engage with also then policies that are more oriented toward defending and protecting Canadian interests as well, and putting in place the guardrails, right, to make that
yeah, yeah,
engagement feasible. So it's that whole kind of the problems of today versus preparing for what might be possible in 5 to 10 years, right? And that's especially, I think, relevant also in the private sector. I mean, one thing for government policies to be kind of operating in a political cycle of 3 to 5 years, but in the business sector, a lot of the cycles are even shorter.
right.
And in fact, we have a question from an audience member asking, so what advice would you give to a Toronto SME exporting to China for the first time to avoid common and costly mistakes? And maybe this gives you an opportunity also to speak more broadly to implications for private sector actors from your book.
Well, I think one of the major issues in doing investments in China, and I had some experience in working on that and for many, many years, and is information access. How much information
Mm,
about the local market and how reliable is that information that you've gotten? And if you see an information regime that is really about generating information for propaganda purposes rather than for transparency, if you see the measurement of prosperity mainly in terms of macro rather than micro data, firms need to be aware of that so that they can digest the information they're receiving on local business conditions and adjust their activities appropriately. If they are receiving macro data on the development of a particular province or even a prefecture within that province, but they're not getting down to the
mm,
street level changes, that information is going to be inadequate. And if they prepare for that in advance, they can ask the right questions of their Chinese interlocutors in terms of getting the information they need to prepare their business strategy for the local market. Similarly, when they are expected to be, one of the great things about tax incentives and tax reduction and so on is it requires the applicant, the firm, to divulge a lot of information about what they're doing. And that's one of the reasons China uses those is about
mm,
getting information from firms. But then if you're in an information environment in which information is really not about transparency and information is mainly on a macro level, that can affect what's expected and also what's accepted in terms of information disclosure. So those are sort of a couple of examples on this, but I think it's also on the other aspect of your question. I'm sorry to do this, but I would just turn people's attention to the report I wrote last year on combining Canadian values with Canadian national interests in our dealing with China, and that's part of my new paper on the question of principled pragmatism, which is that there are much more specific provisions in those papers rather than this rather academic book. But nonetheless, when we're looking at China, for example, we need to have a clear idea of what our national interest is. So let's think about inducing Chinese investment in our natural resource sector and particularly our rare earth sector. So there are many issues bound up in that have to do with Chinese expectations that this book talks about a little bit, but also the intersection of Canadian national interest. We need foreign investment, but Canadian values in terms of, well, what sort of labor relations are going to be pursued in these Chinese-owned mining companies? And we've seen that in other mining activities in northern BC, for example. What sorts of government oversight is needed to ensure that these investments are according with Canadian values on the environment, for example. So that report, which deals with a lot of these things in some greater detail, is where I would go for those sorts of questions.
Well, you never have to be shy, Pittman, about promoting APFC publications. So we were very pleased to have published that piece, and I very much encourage those who are listening to check it out. And in fact, there was a question from the audience about the kind of the specific guardrails that need to be put in place, and that speaks to that. And you referenced it in your last answer as well. And I think what would be relevant is that there's no one answer, right? We need to look at sector by sector and the level of granularity that now is required, right? What is needed in the EVs and batteries might be different than what we would need in terms of investment screening and protection on something else, whether that's in the critical minerals or mining, right? So it's a sector by sector granular approach around the guardrails.
Well, I appreciate the guardrails discussion, and I think it's useful, and I encourage more work in that area. But I also wonder, and forgive me for wondering on this, but whether the guardrails really ought to be imposed on ourselves in terms of what our
Mm,
expectations because our capacity as a medium level country to compel or induce behavior from China is modest. And we're much more effective in persuasion. And that persuasion can take place in the context of accepting China's globalized populism perspective on international relations and on relations with the West, but also acknowledging the Chinese need for that legitimacy that relations with us can provide. So if they want to do, if they're talking about investment in rare earths, or they're talking about
mm,
cooperation in the Arctic, one of the key questions is that cooperation in the Arctic, we have national interests as well as Canadian values at stake there, and the guardrails in part. China, if they decide they want to put a nuclear submarine into the Arctic, there's not much we can do about that. And one of the interesting things that came up in one of your seminars was the importance of the Northern Pacific for Arctic exploration and meddling, if you will, by China and Russia. And that's an area that is of great concern to Canada. But our guardrails need to be a little bit finely tuned in the sense that we have limited ability to make China do or not do things. So part of it is what our expectations are. But when we get China into a process like the Arctic Council and they move from being observer
mm.
status to be possibly full participation or maybe fuller participation, that comes with obligations. And China is attentive to, at least in name, obeying the rules of the institutions that it's part of. And it has touted its commitment to the international system and has wanted to change those rules from within. But nonetheless, it is that's an avenue which can be, I think, helpful with in terms of guardrails on the Arctic, for example. It's just another example.
Yeah, no, I think your point is very well taken that our leverage, our capacity to induce change or behavior change from the CCP and from PRC is very limited. I think that point is very well taken. And of course, persuasion always works better in every relationship, including in relationship with China, but I guess it has its limits in terms of incentives and what is possible. And I guess I wondered, Pittman, if I could ask you a related question, therefore, around sort of the utility of Canada working through these minilaterals or sort of, or even international organizations, to what extent we can enhance our ability to engage with China by coming together with so-called like-minded, I don't like that term, but others who are interested in the same outcomes.
Well, so the two examples I would give are the Arctic Council and the Trans-Pacific Progressive and what have you agreement. China wants in on both of
CPTPP,
those.
yes.
TPTT. China wants in on both of those. China wants to be seen as a responsible international player that's party to all major international organizations. It's not in either one of those fully. We can leverage our influence in those organizations as a way of bringing China to, on the CPTPP, for example, to change its tariff behavior from retaliatory political tariffs a la the United States to tariffs that are really about WTO sanctioned purposes, which have to do with dumping and subsidies and so on. And so inducing China to actually change its trade rules and its trade practice to give more attention to WTO consistent behavior, that's one of the conditions for admission into the CPTPP. And it's a point of leverage for Canada because China, it may suggest that it doesn't need these things. But actually, if you look at the language coming out of the foreign ministry, out of Xi Jinping, out of Zhou Enlai, they very much want to be part of these international systems because they realize changing them from without doesn't really work very well. The challenge is changing them from within, and they have to get in there to do that. So we can act in part as gatekeepers that say, well, admission requires certain things. Now, we learned a lesson, all of us did, from China's accession to
Yes.
the WTO, where certain promises were made about market economy and rule of law that I think to date
And never kept.
still haven't been kept. So, but that actually gives us another point of leverage. Whereas if China makes formalistic assurances that it will comply with the requirements of the CPTPP or Arctic Council, we can very easily say, but we went through this with WTO, so we need more than just assurances. We need concrete
Exactly.
action. And I think that I know that there are people in senior positions in China that are receptive to that argument.
Yeah, I think that could be a much longer conversation and
Yeah,
debate
I
in
know.
terms of can we induce behavior change by welcoming China into certain clubs and then trying to hold it to the standards of that club. And you're right, like the WTO is a really interesting example of that,
Well,
right? That was
one
that was the
way
premise.
is tentative conditional participatory membership, where China has a number of
Mm,
years, say 5, maybe 10, to show its commitment to comply with the rules. Now, that will play right into the inequality, resentment, complexity, alienation problem. So we have to be able to try to deal
yes.
with that. But that sort of conditional, time-limited, performance-based admission is one way to adjust behavior, and it can be done in a way that, we reference the WTO example, we reference the opposition of many members of the Arctic Council or the CPTPP against China's membership. We say we can be helpful, but we can only be helpful if we have assurances more than verbal that you will do these things. So let's have
Mm.
a test period. And in fact, that probationary period is not unknown in China. If you think about foreign investment in both technology and in resources, there are provisions for provisional and kind of probationary participation.
It's interesting because I'm conscious of the fact that we're at the end of our hour. And of course, I want to now unpack further what you're just ending on this note of idea of how do we preserve these islands of rules-based systems, including the one that you mentioned, for instance, on the CPTPP, and at the same time use that as a way to maybe change China's behavior by providing offers of conditional participation. I think that would require a lot more faith in the resilience of those institutions, and given the moment that we're in, where everything is being challenged, that might be harder to do and might be a step too far because there's an effort of actually maintaining CPTPP as a gold
Yeah.
standard when it comes to trade, right? So,
Well, one of the difficulties, and we've seen this in AI, for example, but we've seen it in other things where China, because of its system, is capable of making and reasonably consistently carrying out longer term planning. Whereas we have elections every few years. I mean, our democratic
yeah.
system in many ways kind of militates against long-term policy consistency. And that is a question. And so I would say that again, it's about guardrails on ourselves where we need to be coaching our various political contestants to encourage international organizations as a way of both bringing China in, but also adjusting China's behavior as a condition for being in. And let us not forget, I think the record on China over the years is very clear that China wants to be part of these institutions and these organizations. Their legitimacy depends on it. Their self-perception as a responsible world player depends upon it. That is a key point of leverage for us because we're in and we have the potentially the ability to adjust or couch admission on the basis of these other conditions and
I think you're absolutely right that China would want to be members of these organizations, but I think the challenge for a lot of folks is um, kind of who will change whom through the process of admission,
right,
right? Will
right.
these organizations be more like China, or will China become then more abiding by rules and standards, given its size and its leverage and its
Yeah,
statecraft capacity as well, right? So, I
yeah,
mean, I think
yeah.
it then raises questions: what would that do? What would China's addition to a group like CPTPP do to the nature of that grouping, right? So,
Well, sort of at the beginning of the chapter, I didn't talk about it today, but
yeah.
at the beginning of the closing chapter on recommendations, it basically poses the fundamental question, which is, do we want China in the system or out of the system? And my conclusion is we want China in the system because if we allow
But
China,
on what conditions, though, right?
well,
On
and
what
that's
terms?
that's where we impose as a condition for membership, uh, behavior-based conditions that they are required to meet. And we recognize that we've had experience in the past where they have given lip service but not actually implemented. So we
Exactly.
change the time frame and we change the standards and we change the conditions and the probationary provisions. But I think well, anyway, my perspective is that China outside the system creates essentially
More
what
problems.
the prime minister has suggested, which is an international system which is bereft of the major actors in the world. Now, maybe that's kind of like the alliance of non-aligned states back in the World War, and maybe that's an alternative. But I I personally think having China in the system and the U.S. for that matter, if it gets over its current xenophobic nightmare, um, can can make the system better.
Well, this has been a fascinating discussion, Pittman, just as I had expected it to be. Thank you so much for taking the time, for sharing your insights, for writing another really interesting and insightful book, which is a great contribution to the current discussions on how do we engage with China, and understanding of also of what are the frameworks that are governing behavior and incentives for China's leadership. So again, thank you so much for the hour that you've spent with us. Thank you to everybody who's listened to this and who will be tuning in to the recording. We will make sure that you have a summary from this discussion also available, and hope that you'll be joining us for future webinars in this series. Thank you, everyone, and have a good day.
Thank you so much.